Hello and welcome to Inside the Avatar Studio. Inside the Avatar Studio brings together innovative leaders from the virtual technology frontier to discuss their perceptions, perspectives, and predictions of what being virtual means in today's society. I'm your host, Kevin Feenan, and with me today is Beverly McCarter. Beverly, also known as Bev Landers in Second Life. Bev's passion is to change the world, specifically concerning how we learn via virtual environments. This involves the way in which we design virtual learning environments with wicked problems in mind. Her work focuses on how complexity thrives on creativity born from the collaboration of diverse perspectives, while realizing that this same diversity can cause wars and collapse. Beverly, thank you very much for being on the program.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Cool. We were talking a little bit before the camera started rolling here in terms of some of the stuff that you've been working on is things that I was working on as part of my own dissertation type work. Unfortunately, never quite got completed. So I've got tons and tons and tons of questions around a lot of this stuff, and of course, I don't quite know where even to begin. So it's probably the perfect topic to be going through a chaotic system and not having a really fixed plan on how to go about this. But where I think I'd like to start is with trying to wrap my head around this idea of, what exactly a wicked problem is, from the standpoint of, when we're talking about trying to learn from wicked problems, from what I've been reading over the last week or so, what I'm finding is that the definition of a wicked problem is simply one that cannot really necessarily be defined properly, and one in which we can't necessarily learn from either. It's a pass-fail type thing.
Well, yes and no. You're right. The definition of a wicked problem is as complex systems are as well. But I do have a general definition that I like very much. And, of course, we can talk about some examples so people understand it a little better when you talk about that, too. But the best definition I have found is one by Richard Knowles. He wrote the book, The Leadership Dance. He says that a wicked problem describes a problem that's difficult or impossible to solve because of its incomplete, its contradictory, and changing dynamics that are often difficult to recognize. Moreover, because the complex interdependencies within the system, the effort to solve one aspect of a wicked problem may reveal or create another problem. And sometimes part of trying to solve a wicked problem involves the very same people who are creating it. And it's also important to remember, of course, that wicked problems always occur in the context of human systems, reflecting that diversity of perspectives, paradigms, or views of reality of the various individuals that are involved. And, of course, that also brings with it unpredictability. But that's one of the best definitions I've found for what a wicked problem is. And, of course, examples can be anything where humans have their hands in, like economic, environmental, or political issues, for instance, climate change, healthcare, pandemics, drug trafficking, terrorism, nuclear weapons, nuclear energy, knowledge management, and even business strategy. All of these can have wicked problem aspects to them.
Right. So when we start talking about these things, where if I then may, I guess, sort of extend this a little bit. So essentially, we're not saying that they necessarily can't be solved. It's just that the parameters for solving them are constantly changing and evolving.
Well, they're moving. Absolutely. They're not fixed there because, well, think in terms of emergence. You've got a lot of people involved, and that's the heart, of course, of a wicked problem. And each individual has their own view of how things ought to be done. You could have a group of people, for instance, that are casually and calmly gathering and perhaps talking about something, or they're demonstrating about a particular topic or an issue, and then all of a sudden some stray type of action occurs by one member either in the group or outside the group that sets off a chain reaction and it turns into a deadly mob instead. That's part of emergence. It's not predictable. It can't be reproduced either, and it's really hard to get a handle on. So yeah, it's constantly moving and changing. The boundaries are as a result. So it becomes very, very difficult to try to deal with them.
Right. So how do you see the way narratives sort of fit into this? Because I know that's also part of what it is that you've been looking at. Is this idea of how social cultures and organizational cultures tend to adapt to that particular type of complexity inherent inside.
Well, when I'm talking about narratives, I'm not talking just in terms of the generic story like Aesop's fables. I'm using the term narrative to refer to both the individual and collective view of reality or perspectives that we have. You have at the individual level how an individual sees the way the world works, and that could be impacted by our individual neurochemistry of our brain, our childhood experiences, the groups we belong to growing up, and the reactions that we had to the events that we encountered throughout our life. And then you have, of course, the cultural or group narrative, which is the culture which you're a part of has also its own narrative as to the way the group as a whole is supposed to believe the world is and behave accordingly. And then you have, of course, differences within those as to how much an individual abides by that cultural belief or does not abide by it. And that's what I look at. I look at views of reality and perspectives and how to engage that in virtual simulations in order to move people forward to be more collaborative and creative and less in conflict. Because when you have that much diversity together, you often can get conflict if it's not handled correctly.
You can, but that's to a certain extent that's part of life is in terms of how to handle that type of pressure. Stress.
Absolutely. Well, it's interesting too because the stress can be, yes, it can be, of course, a lot what we term stress in the world today as, fast moving, fast paced, got a lot you've got to get done. But stress can also come from fear. For instance, in today's world, there's an awful lot of fear going on globally because we have basically a meltdown in Europe going on. We don't know what's going to happen here as well. We're seeing a lot of issues here. Iran, it looks like it's heading closer to nuclear production, et cetera, et cetera. All of that brings a lot of uncertainty into our lives. We don't know where we're going to be in 6 months. We may not even know where we're going to be in 12 hours. That type of uncertainty gets back to the basic human fear of death. And that fear of death makes us want to put down as many controls as possible in order to feel safe. When you do that, you're less willing to accept somebody else's perspective or view of reality because it threatens your own and it brings back that uncertainty. And that's when you get extremism, and that's when you get people punching each other's lights out as a result and getting into fisticuffs as well as arguments that become very heated and aren't productive. And that can cause an awful lot of stress.
So how do you find these virtual environments tend to help? Let me backtrack a little bit, because to a certain extent, when I'm referring to stress, I'm not just referring to stress on the individual, but I'm also referring to stress on systems and equilibriums in terms of how cultures and individuals and how they form an equilibrium, and then stressors that sort of, from various different aspects will push or pull that in a particular direction. How do you feel that the virtual environment, the way we have it, based on the tools we have now, sort of help mitigate the non-acceptance of certain potential solution avenues to some of these wicked problems?
Well, that of course depends entirely on how the design of the simulation is affected. Virtual environments have a tremendous power to let you take on literally a perspective of someone else, of another culture, another individual, to really feel it from a first-person perspective as opposed to an outsider looking in. That's life-changing. We know that you can have less conflict, greater creativity, greater collaboration because of the wealth of diversity if you're not threatened by that same diversity. And that means you can move systems forward in positive ways as opposed to going through systems collapse. In virtual environments, because of the very immersive nature of it, with presence and transference, you can literally become someone else. That widens your perspective. There's an old fable, I don't know if you remember it, about the nine blind wise men and the elephant? I don't know if you've heard that one before.
I don't think I've heard that one.
I think it's an ancient Indian or Chinese, I can't remember now, parable. But basically, nine blind wise men were brought before the emperor, the king, and there was an elephant in the room that they didn't know was there. And they were each brought to the elephant and asked to touch what was immediately in front of them, and then to describe what was in front of them. So one, of course, had the trunk, one had the tail, one had the side, one had the leg, and each thought it was something different. For instance, the trunk was a snake, the leg was a tree trunk, the side was like a wall. They were all right in their part that they were looking at. But like a complex system, we can't see all the parts. But the more diversity we're able to accept, and it doesn't mean getting rid of your own belief or view of reality, but extending it to incorporate that, yes, others see a different slice of the pie, a different piece of this complex system. And all these pieces fit together to make the truth of the whole system. But you have to understand, too, complex systems are so large that it is a virtual impossibility to ever see the whole system. And you can't get outside the system to see it. You are inside it at all times. But you can see a greater range of possible truths within your framework, as opposed to a very narrow sliver or slice, as the blind man just touching one part did.
Right. I want to get back to something that you said when you first started to talk about this. And you mentioned the word design, which is the thing that I think is sort of sticking with me right at the moment. Starting off from the idea that it's not necessarily the virtual environment itself, but it's the way in which we are creatively designing inside this environment that is actually one of the key aspects that leads us towards this I guess sort of extension of understanding the system in which we're in.
Oh, absolutely. That's one of the things I like about Second Life, because it is content created driven, as opposed to having an outside organization script it and define it for you. It's an ever-evolving system itself, and that leads to an awful lot of creativity, and it's one of the great jewels of Second Life is that ability. You have to have that diversity and the creativity going on. And virtual environments that allow emergence to occur, are designed to allow emergence to occur, benefit tremendously from it. For instance, there are three core elements of human dynamics that virtual environments can facilitate tremendously, and that's, of course, identity, and this includes the avatar. A lot of people forget how powerful the avatar is. The avatar we choose is not just a reflection of what's in our head, but it can also have a feedback loop and impact us psychologically, behaviorally, emotionally as well. Another aspect is, of course, the relationships we develop, our understanding of, quote, the other. We define ourselves not only by the groups that we join, but also by who we are not, the other. Then there's also, of course, the narrative structures, the third part, those views of reality and how we share that information. All of those type of dynamics need to go into the designs of the simulations of the virtual environments in order to maximize this emergence within a complex system, and therefore maximize creativity and innovation and the collaboration that can occur from all of that.
Right. What about the social dynamic, though? Because I mean, quite often when we
that's the relationships.
Well, sort of. I think I want to go a little bit beyond that. I mean, some of the folks that we've talked to in the past have talked about Second Life and the social aspect. Oh shoot! Of course, the term I'm looking for is now just completely blown out of my head. But I mean, in terms of the way that we connect with one another socially here, I mean, this whole idea of the environment and the social network sort of being one and the same, and it almost sounds as if the way you're looking at this is that it needs to sort of be looked at as two separate and distinct components that each have their own part to play within this.
Well, that could get back to what's referred to as a chaotic system. And yes, you want the unscripted environment. That's the social networking and the relationships, because that's where the greatest innovation and creativity occurs. But you also need to have some sort of boundaries defined to operate in so you can get a foothold to move forward. That does not mean a heavy hierarchical structure or scripting going on, but a general idea of what's your game plan, what you want to do. So you have to have a subsystem developed within the major system in order to maximize your creativity and collaboration within the environment. So you're looking at a chaotic environment with that.
Right, but the whole idea of defining boundaries on something that ideally should be boundless.
A chaotic system isn't a tight bounding system. It is porous. It's movable. It's flexible. Like we talked about before. Think in terms of a Lorenzo tractor, the butterfly flapping its wings, for instance, in the Yucatan, causing a hurricane off the coast of Africa, type of thing. The boundaries aren't fixed. The boundaries are flexible and movable, and they adjust as the system adjusts and the people within that system change direction based on the information coming from the environment. You may have an idea, okay, this is what I want to do, and this is what we want to build, or this is the goal we want to achieve. But things change out there. The environment changes, and that means you have to change your game plan and your goals too, or in what you want to do with your life, or what you want to do for your company, or what you want to do in your endeavors. So you have to have a general idea of what you want to do, but you have to be flexible and adaptable because the environment's not fixed. It is moving constantly. It's very dynamic, and you have to be dynamic too.
Right. One of the things that I think is kind of interesting about this is, quite often I look at a lot of these particular types of chaotic systems from a couple of different perspectives. One is this idea that was proposed by Russ Marion, which talks about chaotic systems can lead to order in terms of the way things tend to line up over time. And I think to a certain extent, when we're talking about these particular environments here, you can get to a point where a particular group of individuals who are working on a particular problem reach and I apologize for the words I'm about to use here, but they're the only words that I can think of that fit. And I'm quite sure somebody's going to whack me up the head for this later. Once you start working on a problem, eventually the social grouping that's working on that particular problem reaches a state of minimum entropy in terms of being comfortable with where it is that they've arrived at, and then are unwilling to go beyond their comfort zone once they've hit that minimum energy level. Right, so all the chaos that's going on around them, they eventually get down to this minimum point. And then it stops. It's sort of we get to a point where, as much as we say we would like to have open systems feeding information into this and constantly evolving, constantly building, social networks tend to try to find that minimum state and then sit there.
Well, true, and that's basically group theory dynamics. They do.
Yeah.
But if you're in an organization and your team can't be flexible, can't be adaptable, as the environment changes, your company's going to go bankrupt.
But how do you know that you're suffering from groupthink until after the problem has passed that's pointed it out?
Well, that's where the wonderful thing called the process enneagram, that's also called a living system, is a wonderful facilitative technique for handling this. It literally has been around for a long time, many, many years. It's been used internationally, has a wealth of case studies to back it up now as a result, too. But it is a process that's based on a deep understanding of counseling psychology techniques and principles. And counseling psychology is all about helping people move through transformational change and groups to move through transformational change. People do. They want to get into a stasis. They want to get into a steady state, and they will sit down and not move once that's reached. But to do that means death in today's world. In the 21st century, you can't afford to do that. You just take a look at Kodak. Kodak was not flexible and adaptable and went bankrupt as a result. So it's the way to do that is through conversation, through talking, through laying out ground rules with the group that allows new ideas to be spoken in a safe environment. And that's the same thing with designing these virtual environments as well. You have to design them to be safe. You can't allow people to be shut down because they say something that seems off kilter, may seem like it's out of left field, it doesn't agree necessarily with your particular view of reality or your perspective. You have to be respectful of all voices. That doesn't mean necessarily you follow all voices, but you have to be respectful of letting it be heard. This also can lead to people being happy and getting group buy-in because they have felt they've been heard. You get passive-aggressive people that will stymie an operation, they'll backtrack, they won't move forward, they won't help, they won't cooperate if they feel they've not been heard. So again, it's very important. You've all been to meetings where somebody had a wild harebrained scheme about how things ought to be done, and they piped up, and somebody moaned and groaned in the back and said, "Oh, God, where did you come up with that idea?" And then, of course, the person suddenly sat down, embarrassed, red-faced, and felt basically chastised and dug in their heels and said, "Okay, I won't share anymore, I won't talk anymore, and I'm not going to help anymore either." So this all gets back to group dynamics and how best to facilitate people being able to talk, to share, and to work together. And virtual environments are key for that as well.
Right. Now, one of the I will fully admit to doing the Wicked Problems for Dummies course in advance of showing up. But I mean, it's a lot of cases. I guess to a certain extent, some of the three main strategies, and this would seem very obvious to me. As a matter of fact, I would probably extend this. I mean, they talk about three main strategies for tackling these particular types of problems, one being authoritative, one being competitive, one being collaborative. And you've described the collaborative aspect, but sometimes you get into situations where that authoritative perspective is really what is required in order to get by a particular hurdle, right? It's
absolutely.
Quite often, sometimes having a dictator is the right thing to be doing, as much as we don't care to admit it. So how does that play when you try to strip down these particular types of things into the hands of a few, or where I think more to the point of what I'm sort of trying to get at is, especially in organizations that are very hierarchical driven, such as governments, military, these particular types of things, where it's the social environment is not designed really to be collaborative. It's designed to be authoritative. Right? How does that help or hinder in terms of trying to get by some of these challenges? Because quite often, those that know how to lead aren't necessarily those that are best in solving the problem. Sure. They're two very different skill sets.
Absolutely. And this gets back to there is never a silver bullet. There is never one tool to fix all problems. You have to come to the table with a toolbox full of different ways of interacting and facilitating, depending on what the circumstance requires at the moment. If I only had a hammer and I tried to fix a plumbing issue, I'd be in a big problem. So this is the same with dealing with wicked problems and complex situations and simulations as well. You've got to have a lot of different tools at your disposal to handle, and different ways of interacting. So yeah, there are times when you've got to have somebody who can take charge and say, we have to do this now. We've got to move this way. Things are critical. There's a fire in the building, and I got to get you all out. So absolutely. Then there are other times when you're problem solving, you're wanting to basically generate a lot of different ideas, and you don't want an authoritative type of this is the way we're going to do it, because you're trying to generate ideas in a safe environment. And that's where it becomes much more of an emergent type of system, with people in a safe environment sharing ideas, brainstorming, and not having any limitations. We can all go back to our history books and look what happened to the Bay of Pigs in Cuba when that wasn't allowed. So again, it depends on the circumstance that you're facing and what tool you need at the moment. And yes, they're all needed at some time. It just depends on the circumstance and the situation you find yourself in. But the main rule is there is never one silver bullet. There just isn't.
One of the other concepts that's sorry, there goes my pen. One of the everything's falling apart here. One of the other concepts that was being talked about a little bit is this idea of what they call hyperbolic discounting, where as part of going through the exercise, regardless of what strategy you use to tackle a particular problem, where we have this value judgment depending upon whether solutions are near or far to the present point in time that we are right at the moment, right? And how people change the ways that they approach problems based upon, I guess to a certain extent, to one of the major parameters being time. Right? I think the example that's given is that if I offer you $1 now or $3 3 days from now, which option are you going to take? Compared to if I offer you $1 a year from now and $3 a year and a day from now, which option would you take? The nearer term always seems to go with the more in terms of the sure thing, whereas the farther out we go, we tend to look at more of the, I guess, optimistic type view. I guess the difference between optimistic and pessimistic view. How often do those play into the I guess sort of these particular types of problems, especially when you start looking at it from an organizational perspective? I guess because quite often I see it where organizations take the cheap way out rather than necessarily doing things right.
Well, that tends to go back again to fear that we talked about before. When you're faced with fear, you're not going to change. You're going to continue to slam a square peg in a round hole that used to work, but no longer does. Humans are resistant to change, especially when they're afraid. And when the environment becomes very uncertain, then you have greater fear. And you have less change, and you have less embracing of uncertainty, and it goes back to the whole thing. But again, what you were describing with earlier here, it tends to be almost taken from a page with John Nash and game theory, but I have my own personal qualms and bugaboos concerning that, basically. I'm not a big fan of any type of theory that assumes that people are rational. You got to remember, one of my backgrounds is in counseling psychology and human systems, and I know people are irrational. And when you're looking at complex adaptive systems, that irrationality is part of the definition. It says it's unpredictable. So you can say general patterns you can recognize and say generally, yes, these patterns will be followed, but you have to understand outlier data will always be there. You're always going to have what some people refer to as that black swan event occurring. Somebody is going to pop up and do something totally unexpected out of left field and change the entire dynamic. Very much like, for instance, Einstein would have been considered an outlier. He definitely changed the course of history. Bin Laden is also an outlier. He also changed the course of history. So these type of events, we can't predict, we can't expect. And so you do the best you can with understanding general patterns, but you have to understand that nothing's fixed, nothing's certain, and you have to be flexible and adaptable. I tend to like to equate it all to the way special ops and the military operate. And you've got to remember, I used to work with the National Defense University, so I tend to use a lot of military analogies as a result. But special ops are trained in specific skills, but skills that are core skills, able to be combined and regrouped in an almost infinite number of ways in order to meet an unknown context, an unknown situation that they can't even dream of at the moment, that they will run into later in the future. So too do we need to be the same way now, and that's where virtual environments enable this. Through the use of these narratives, structures, and design the environment that allow the emergence to occur of people interacting and sharing information. We too can learn our specific skills, but be able to be flexible and adaptable and understand how to combine those skills in new and creative ways to meet the challenges of the 21st century.
Well, speaking of which, I mean, what do you feel are some of the immediate challenges that we're looking at right now where these techniques could be applied? I mean, we've talked about politics and the environment and a couple of other odds and ends, but I mean, are there other areas where you see these techniques?
I firmly believe that we're in a new smack dab in the middle, in fact, of a revolution as powerful and profound as both the agricultural and the industrial revolution. And this one is based on human interaction and conversation. Because of our hyperconnectivity around the globe, it's facilitated as a result. And there's no putting the genie back in the bottle. We can't go backwards necessarily, unless, of course, we face an entire global collapse and we get back to individual villages again, in which case it all may be for naught. But generally, yes, everything you're going to be doing, everything you're doing currently involves other people, involves having to talk to, associate with, pass information on to, collaborate in some way, put a piece of the puzzle together. So these type of skills are going to be incredibly important. You're still going to need your deep academics, of course, so your sciences, et cetera, but overlaying all of that, you're going to have to be able to talk to somebody and share ideas with somebody. You're going to have to be able to try to sidestep the landmines of conflict because somebody doesn't see the problem the way you do, that somebody actually has a different take on how that ought to be done. It doesn't mean necessarily you have to accept it, but you have to be respectful that somebody else sees it differently. And I think once we're able to get humans to that phase or that stage, we're going to see an awful lot of innovation take off like gangbusters.
The whole aspect of innovation, one of the things that I've been talking about for years, and one of the reasons why I started Rockcliffe actually, was this whole idea that, I'm not sure if you're familiar with this guy, he's British, so I'm going to assume the answer is no. James Burke, who used to have a television series called Connections. And one of the things that he used to talk about back in the 1970s was this whole idea that innovation is outpacing our ability to think and to react and to make appropriate decisions. Keep in mind, he proposed this back in the 1970s before there was Apple, right? So but I mean, to a large extent, I mean, more and more what I'm seeing is that, and I firmly believe that he actually probably really hit the nail on the head, probably just a couple of decades before it really took hold, is this idea that we are becoming a society of specialists, where nobody really understands the large, holistic, big picture view of sort of what's going on in any given particular type of technology. So, when I was a kid, and I will not admit how many years ago that was, I could go down to the Radio Shack store, and I could pick up a little kit that would allow me to build my own telephone. Right? I mean, you could order these things out of a catalog. Yes, surprise, surprise. And the inner workings of something like that were very clear to understand. There is no way in today's society that I would be able to put together a cell phone.
Sure.
And understand all the various different components in terms of all the nitty-gritty bits and pieces that go into it and how they individually work. Whereas, the old-fashioned telephones was like, oh yeah, it's a couple of wires, a battery, and what have you.
Well, this gets back to, very simply, we're at a in fact, I think the Santa Fe Institute for Complexity describes it as a super exponential. Moore's law basically states that technology advances at an exponential rate. And of course, there's some argument going on currently that we're stopping, dead in its track. But the Santa Fe Institute is describing basically that we're at a super exponential track. So yes, there is no way one person can know it all. So this gets back to what we talked about earlier. The necessity of being able to collaborate, talk to, share information, and work with other people, because no one is going to be able to do it all by themselves. There's just too much out there. It's way too expansive. But one of the key elements that must be learned is how to connect the dots. And if you look at some of the push currently with education and with the military, etc., they're all looking for how do we teach critical thinking. Critical thinking is all about connecting the dots. You've got to be able to see the big picture. You've got to be able to see all the moving parts. You've got to see how those moving parts interrelate. That does not mean that you have to know how to do it all. But you have to know where to go find the information, find the people who do know how to do it, put them on your team, and get it built. So it's about networking, it's about connecting, it's about sharing information, building relationships, building trust, and moving forward. Being flexible, being adaptable. It's all part of the same issue.
It is, but when a good proportion of the U.S. population is getting the information that they need to make these critical decisions based upon Fox News, whose sole and express purpose is to not allow people to connect the dots.
Well, you're going to find that with anybody. You can look at bloggers, you can look at MSNBC as well. You're going to find, well, this is again where it is incumbent upon the individual to be critical in their analysis, to look at as many sources of information as possible. We all know you don't go to one book, read it, and say, well, that's the truth. You have to have a library. You've got to look at a diversity of opinions. You've got to look at a diversity of perspectives. And then somewhere in there you find your own happy medium where you're comfortable. But this is, again, goes back to what the whole theme of this conversation has been. It's all about diversity. It's all about being respectful. It's all about the conversation. And it's all about owning individual skills that allow us to connect dots and be able to be flexible and adaptable in an ever-changing environment. Absolutely.
So what? Because I mean, I see even up here in Canada. I mean, we see the same problem, right? I mean, for whatever reason, critical reasoning skills are one of those things that are not taught effectively inside the public education system.
Well, in fact, if you look at that goes back to the Industrial Revolution, and basically we developed the schoolhouse and classes in the way they're done in order to teach in a linear sequential fashion, just like an assembly line in an industrial building would be, because it was easier for the teachers to process as many students as possible. And in today's world, that no longer works. And when you look at what cognitive dissonance, for instance, who here is a fan of WoW? Show hands. Okay. Cognitive dissonance is an incredible guild. Peggy Sheehy, of course, is a very prominent member of the group. That are using World of Warcraft, for instance, in their classrooms, and they're part of ISTE as well, and SIG, in order to try to see new ways of engaging students, which facilitates just what we're talking about, laterally thinking, connecting the dots, critically thinking and analyzing from multiple different viewpoints, and accepting that there are multiple viewpoints out there. And going back to the parable of the 9 blind wise men, each one saw a part, but collectively they all had a truth. And it's very important to recognize that. There is never only one truth. There's always many, many different shades of it. And this gets back to counseling psychology again in group dynamics. So yes, absolutely. It's education has to change because it was designed for an industrial environment, and we have moved way beyond it.
So are virtual worlds going to help with that?
Absolutely. You know that linear sequential teaching causes the atrophy of axonic connections, axons in the brain literally will atrophy and die. And when that happens, you can't do the lateral thinking. Now, the good thing is our brains are plastic, and they've demonstrated with research that even into very old age, we still are able to grow new neurons, etc. So it can grow back. But it is very important that we continue what we're doing with virtual environments in order to create these lively environments that facilitate self-discovery and collaboration and conversation and sharing of ideas and problem solving, where we can dive into an environment with the bots you and I were talking previously about, that are self-learning based on heuristics and not on decision trees, that then allow the students to become challenged. They can't game it. They can't predict it. It's not scripted. It's not already pre-planned. These bots are able to act according to general rules, but that encompasses or affords them an almost infinite array of reactions as a result to whatever stimulus is given to them. And that means the students, when they're given a problem to solve, they really have to bring their personal skills to bear. They're not regurgitating an answer. Because I know we all remember math classes when we were growing up where we had a different way to solve the problem, but it was wrong because it wasn't in the book. Well, right, so that's gone from now on.
Right. So let me ask you a bit of a loaded question then, because hopefully I'm taking away partially the right message here, but so we've got a society right at the moment which is, from an economic standpoint, is valuing depth rather than breadth. But from a leadership perspective and from an innovation perspective and a political perspective in terms of people making correct political and economic and environmental choices, we need to have a society that values the breadth of subject matter over necessarily the depth. So are these two ideas in terms of where society sort of needs to be placing itself potentially mutually exclusive with one another?
No, in fact, I don't think it's one or the other. In fact, most of the research is showing that and understanding that both breadth and depth have to go hand in hand, not mutually exclusive and not one dominating the other. And this gets back to chaotic systems that we talked about earlier. Chaotic systems are all about people having individual skills, depth. They know how to do their widget. They know how to do their special thing that they do. But at the same time, they are able to see the big picture. They can see where other people, their jobs, their skills fit in, and they're able to group and regroup as need be to accomplish whatever project they're needing to do. You see, with a lot of the academia, for instance, University of Arizona is doing very, very well with this, especially in their complex systems departments, and understanding that we're moving more towards the humanities being valued. For the longest time, science was king and the humanities was not. And they're now starting to recognize that the humanities and science are getting back to a Renaissance state. They're getting back to being joined again, because that affords the greatest amount of flexibility and creativity and adaptability in an ever-changing environment. And so, no, I don't think it's either or. I don't think that everyone thinks that way either. I'm seeing a lot of changes occurring, a movement occurring within academic institutions as well, solidifying this. And I know the military has already been doing it. They've been doing it for years with net-centric warfare.
Right, but it does require that those groups that are focused on education have to essentially step up their game. They have to go beyond the silo approach.
I think many are too. Take a look at what MIT, Cornell, Stanford University are all doing with their open courseware as well. You're seeing it happening. There's an awful lot of collaboration going on across the board. And then there's, of course, the state of Georgia that has now opened up virtual worlds for all their public school systems. So, yeah, I think there is. There's a lot of movement in this area, and it's kind of a nice time to be if you are a humanities type of person. If you're a generalist, this is a very good time to be.
Right. So what? Do you and if you don't want to answer this question, you don't have to. So what do you say to the teachers and the academics out there that are crying and screaming for state and federal governments to put more money into education when they're constantly cutting back on the type of programs that are allowing us to develop both breadth and depth inside the population.
I think we have to, and I know this is incredibly painful, and I know a lot of people are going to disagree with me, but I think we're reaching the maximum sustainability of that particular complex system. And complex systems will implode and collapse if they do not have innovation and change occurring. It's just the way it works. And when you get a complex system that gets to a size where it doesn't have enough resources coming in, it's got to change. So you've got to become more creative than, okay, let's look at this problem from a whole different perspective. Trying to do a square peg in a round hole isn't working anymore. And we're seeing a lot of this change occurring with some very innovative groups, like I mentioned before, with cognitive dissonance. And remember, that's a guild in World of Warcraft that has over 300 educators in that one guild. That means there are a lot of systems changing around the world from all those members who are in that guild. New ways of teaching, new ways of thinking, new ways of doing. I don't know what the future's going to hold, but I envision one where we're going to have a change in the way academics are done. Virtual worlds and simulations are going to radically change that. You're going to have instructors step off the lectern. They're not going to be teaching anymore by lecturing. They're going to become more like Socrates. They're going to become mentors. They're going to have students will do their homework for once. Do their homework. Come into the class, and instead of having it regurgitated and reread to them, they'll be expected to have read it. They'll be expected then to step into a simulation with these intelligent, self-learning bots that do not follow decision trees. They will step into a simulation to prove they really understand the concepts. They will be posed a problem. They'll have to solve the problem. And the teacher is going to be their mentor. The teacher's going to be saying, that didn't work so well. What if we tried this? Have you thought about this other way? That was a really great way to look at it. That was very novel. That was different. If you think in terms of the way, for instance, again, going back to counseling psychology, or my other graduate degree is in fine art, in both of those situations, you were never told what the answer was. You were expected instead to figure it out. You were given basic skills you learned, and then you had to use those skills in new and creative ways to solve the problem. So pretty soon, you're going to see education changing where your education is going to radically change. You have students be able to access this from home, from mobile devices. They won't necessarily be in a physical classroom all the time with them. It's going to be a very different and brave new world.
So as the sort of ancient Chinese curse goes, may you live in interesting times, I think. I guess one of the things, and I've got my little soapbox on some of these things, right? But I mean, every time I've seen a change in technology come along, there's been a couple of different things I've noticed that sort of goes along with it. One of which certainly has been that when we have a radical change in technology, quite often you need to get into third and fourth generation tools before that particular technology really starts to take off, because in general the population that is relating to those particular tools, they're not specialists in doing the deep coding that needs to be done. So if we take a look at games that are based on the Unity engine, if we take even things we're doing at Second Life and OpenSim, and some of these other platforms that we have available out here right at the moment, I mean, these are still very highly dependent upon designers, graphic artists. They're highly dependent upon programmers in order to really tease out the best of what you can do, which is a highly expensive process.
And that's changing. Right? So, that's changing.
Right, but it's obviously not here today. So how do you envision a few weeks? Well, I know one tool is, according to what we were talking about before. But I mean, that's just one tool amongst many, and we'll come back to that in a moment. But I mean no, I'm
talking about the interface for Unity 3D.
Oh, okay. Sorry, my apologies. I didn't. You realize that there's a new interface coming. So wait a second, let me finish out this question, then we'll come back to that because I want to ask about that as well. I know you've got connections with all these different organizations that are really doing a lot of the absolute cutting edge type of thing. They're out there, they're looking for stuff that's on the edge, right? And they've got the money to put in to do it. What are you seeing in terms of toolkits that are in development that we should be looking forward to, that eventually will make their way down to small, medium-sized businesses, educators, and nonprofits, at some point in the next 2 to 3 years?
Oh, you can look at it right now. It's happening. It's just amazing things. The emotive headset, the EMTOIV, has incredible capability right now for telling if the person who's wearing the headset is engaged or not in the environment, if they're happy, if they're unhappy, they're angry, if they're content, if they're joyful. These metrics can be picked up by just wearing the headset, and it's a wireless headset to boot. So imagine being able, and they're already doing this, an instructor can have your students wear that. You can make the environment, using again the dynamic decision network we talked about with these bots, you can take that same algorithm and plug it into the environment. So the environment is able to read when the learner is not engaged. And suddenly it can change the storyline, it can change its reaction, and it can suddenly get in the face of the learner and do something different, unexpected, to get their attention, get them emotionally engaged and learning again. This is already here. This is going on now, which is very exciting. There's a lot that's happening. I think, too, we talked about Unity 3D. My biggest problem that I had when I started working in Unity 3D is I am not a graphic designer. My graduate degree is in studio art. And I don't necessarily want to learn how to do Maya, though I am being dragged kicking and screaming into it, so I'm doing it. But the ease and flexibility of OpenSim and Second Life to be able to instantly throw up a building, slap on your textures, and do rapid prototyping is something that should not be lost. So I've talked with Unity 3D at the Game Tech conference down in Orlando recently, and some other individuals who are excellent programmers. Then they've agreed. They're working on building an interface that will be sold on the Unity 3D store that will allow you to do the average person rapid prototyping and building. Now, if you want to be fully polished, you'll still need to go ahead and have a team come and do that. But you'll be able to do your concepts and your ideas and flesh it out to a fairly good degree yourself without having to know how to do all the others. So this is all coming. I'm translating my astronomy center, phases 1 and 2, that recently won at the Federal Virtual Worlds Challenge into Unity 3D, and we're building it as a plug-and-play template that will allow instructors who may not know how to use Virtual Worlds to teach your courses. We're building this so that they can drop their material into it and be able to be up and running with it. So they can change it out easily enough. And it will be in Unity, and it can run on a desktop, it can run on their websites.
That's very cool. The other thing that we were talking about was heuristics before we got...
my bots, the bots.
Your bots. So what's happening in that particular space? Because when we're talking about, to bring this back to the original topic, right? Because we're slowly, for some reason, these talks always turn into technology discussion. So I want to bring it back a little bit. When we're talking about bots and heuristics, this really, I think, opens up doors in order to, that original topic where we were talking about design of problems and being able to provide a virtual environment that designs around certain of these things. It will
also enable that educational scenario that we just talked about too. In this case, Dennis Beatty with Innovative Decisions Incorporated has an incredible algorithm called the Dynamic Decision Network. It's been used by the military for years to help generals make decisions in complex environments, what's known as the fog of war, where you just can't you can't see enough of the problem to make a decision. The DDN helps do that. It's probability based, it's Bayesian based. It's able to take live data coming in and recalculate instantly so that it does respond to an ever-changing complex environment. So the power of dropping that into a bot is incredibly exciting to me. In terms of education as well, that means we can finally have simulations that truly challenge individuals to think creatively, to think critically, to actually learn their skills, be able to combine those skills in new and innovative ways in order to meet whatever problem's been placed before them. They can't game it and they can't predict it. And these bots will enable it. We're still waiting. I'm hoping funding will come through, but we know what the funding climate is like right now, so I'm sitting tight. But if the funding does come through, I'm hoping within a year we'll have these bots ready for possibly off-the-shelf implementation with the general public.
That would be fairly cool. So would they interact with something like OpenSim or Second Life that, well, I mean, Second Life's going to be a bit of a problem because they closed environment, right? But I mean, it's I mean, will they be accessible to people, at the grassroots education level?
I hope
or is this something that's being aimed at, sort of corporate America and that type of a wallet?
No. I don't know what the price point is going to be. I don't know where it will be in the end. But I think the biggest cost is going to be in the development of it, of course, as anything new. And this currently, from my understanding, this doesn't exist anywhere else at the moment. Different, similar to, but not quite there, are out there. But it's kind of nice when the guys in the military hear about this and they look at me and say, this is historic. And they're right. It really is historic. And this goes back to what we said before. We're living in an exciting time, but the full conversation, going back to complex adaptive systems, it's all about the conversation. It's all about the individuals. It's about the individuals knowing who they are, what they are, and understanding, too, that not everybody's like them, and that's okay. It's about working together, sharing relationships, sharing information, developing relationships and trust. All of this comes into play today. And as educators and for corporate as well as for military, as well as for enterprise and for education, it's incredibly important that people start to understand this. It's not going away. It's not a flash in the pan. It has always been there. This is part of the human condition. But where we are today with being hyper-connected globally, it's made it front and center in importance. You can't ignore it. You can't shove it off to the side anymore. You have to deal with it. And the fact that people are so radically different, even from neighborhood or from street. My next door neighbor and I may be absolutely, totally different, but we live side by side, and that's okay. It's what makes the world unique. It's what makes it exciting. And again, it's what drives complex systems. So the trick here is to facilitate the collaboration and to minimize the conflict. And I'm hoping that the latest innovations and disruptor technologies that are coming along will help facilitate this conversation and help people move forward. I'm very excited about it. And as an architect and designer of these spaces, I know that I'm moving very quickly towards trying to design spaces as an architect in the physical world does. And that means designing them to... my computer's going blank on me.
That's the power on the monitor.
Well, I'm not sure what's going on here, but you are blank screen. I hope I'm still transmitting. But it's very important that we move forward with all of these ideas that we've been talking about today.
Right. So I'm going to wrap up with our little signature, and we've been alluding to this all the way along, but I'm going to wrap up with the signature question that we ask at the end of each of these little sessions that we have here. If you had a crystal ball, what do you think the impacts of virtual worlds will be on society 5 to 10 years into the future?
Where do I think society will be?
Mm-hmm.
Wow, we've already got Google goggles out there where you've got augmented reality. We've already got kids that are playing in the streets instead of Dungeons and Dragons like when I was in college. They're doing it with augmented reality in the streets. You've got private enterprise now putting man in spaceships, and we've got tourism around the corner now with the Dragon X, etc., that's been flying around. We've got self-learning bots coming around that's going to change the way we learn and relate, problem solve. Critical thinking's going to come back. I think we're going to have, well, either one of two scenarios. You're going to have an incredibly stovepiped world that goes up in flames because so many people became so afraid. Or you're going to have an incredibly freewheeling, innovative, creative society that is suddenly able to get a handle on a lot of our wicked problems and be okay with those problems that we can't quite solve yet but are working on. So I'm afraid I'm never one that ever has things black and white. I always see things in gray, so I can see either path happening.
Yeah, the future's always brighter in Technicolor. Anyway, Beverly, I'd like to thank you very much. I mean, that's all the time we have for the broadcast show today. I'd like to invite you to stay for an after-show wrap-up. We've had a few questions from the audience here that the few people we've got available to us here. It's been wonderful having you on the show, and I'm looking forward to good things to come.
Thank you. It was my pleasure to be here. I appreciate the invitation.
Thank you. Well, that's it from the Rockcliffe Rotunda. I would like to thank everyone for being with us today. Inside the Avatar Studio is produced by Bevan Whitfield and Rockcliffe University Consortium, technical production by Robustus Hacks and Mel Burns in association with Metaverse TV. For more information on Inside the Avatar Studio, please check out our website at avatarstudio.info or subscribe to our Twitter or Facebook fan page at uRockcliffe.